Hello and welcome to another episode of Conversations Aloud, where we have conversations with everyday people on geopolitics, culture, and society. And today we're discussing what is gender identity, that very scary subject that we hear so much about. Why is it a controversial topic today and how it plays a role in society and current politics? We're joined by Dee Gray, who is a transfemme, non binary lesbian parent of three, who has a degree in gender studies and a minor in computer science. Welcome to the show, Dee.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Hadi.
Perfect. Dee, first of all, explain to me what is a trans femme, lesbian, non-binary. I understand the parent bit, but the ones before.
The parents a pretty clear understanding in today's societies. Let's actually break those apart. I'm not going to do them in order. I want to start about non-binary first because this is a fun conversation for me because it was really my first understanding of a different way to view the experience of gender. I was raised in a very high control conservative culture, a high control religion. And so the concept of there being anything else besides this, very strict male versus very strict female understanding kind of was really bore into me at the very beginning of my life and carried with me, but it didn't ever match as much. So but I never really connected to the idea of being trans initially, right?
Trans is a trans person someone who was one gender that transitioned to another gender.
Yes, when we say trans as opposed to cis, it's just like the way we use trans in every other word we use in it. Transport, something moved, right?
Transition. Okay.
Transcontinental. We've moved from one continent to the other. So a trans identity is just an identity that is shifted from one to the other. Where cis, like a cistern, is something that is just straight, right? It's just identified and has not moved. It's stationary. So cis isn't a slur as much as it's a description for an experience that is the most common experience. Yeah. So for trans, it's really just a shift of identity. It's a shift of understanding of my gender. And so that happened very late in my life. I was 38. So trans itself is really that understanding of identity more than your body representation. And while I say that, identity is not entirely culturally driven. We now understand that there are times while during our gestation and as we head into puberty, where our body receives some level of hormones based off of what should be a number of factors that go into being created. But that doesn't all happen at once. It's not like bop, bop, right? Like it's not a fork in the road as much as a shaping of the road as you go on. And so if those things change, if the body changes, you can get very much a very strong sexual view, right? Like sex, right? So you can have all of the testosterone you want, but then there's another part where you get flooded with hormones again during gestation, where identity generally forms as the brain is formed. And those things happen separately and then they can continue to happen and shift. So gender identity, while we talk about it as an identity and it is very much the thing that you build towards, right? Or that you feel, it still has some biological component, which
Yeah,
I
okay.
think is really
That's
interesting.
interesting. Before I go into that deeper, so when you say I understand the trans, the non-binary piece, and then and that femme, what do they mean?
So non-binary, there's lots of ways that people talk about genders that are separate from male and female. I chose non-binary when I first came out because it made the most sense to me. So non-binary is really this idea that when you talk about male or female, they really ultimately, especially culturally, come with a lot of expectations. They're pretty thin boxes. And a lot of people feel very comfortable fitting into one of those boxes, right? Whether they're trans or cis, they feel comfortable going, I'm going to fit into this box. But for a lot of people, they're not. So for me, the way I really looked at it is I was raised as a male for 38 years of my life, right? And I never did a really good job at it, to be
What do you
fair.
mean by that?
But I don't know, here in the States and specifically here in my state, there was this really not awful, but it was this joke that we would say that if someone that is male did something that was feminine or not masculine enough, they would take away your man card.
Hmm.
They'd say, I'm sorry, I'm going to need your man card. So I used to joke when I first came out, I used to joke, they're like, "How did you know I was trans?" I was like, "I didn't. I just ran out of man cards. They kept taking them away. And so I just don't have them."
Yeah.
So,
So
so that
so
experience,
do you
yeah,
think, when we think about kind of female and male, like the traditional sense of female and male, I
yeah,
think there's a biological aspect to it. But, to me, it seems like the conversation is also a lot about roles and responsibilities. Um,
100%.
so how does one kind of, I guess, with your experience, how did you, aside from the man card being taken away, how did you know that, "Hang on, maybe I am not the traditional male kind of sense, and there was something else?" Was it a feeling? Was it a thinking? A thought? How did that come about?
That's a really good question that ultimately dives into a lot of history and trauma of mine. So I won't go super deep into that. Instead, what I'll say is it was a constant, right? It was this thing. Sometimes it was a feeling, sometimes they were actions, often they were ideas when someone would say, men aren't good caretakers for children, right? And I was like, but I love taking care of children. So this constant, anytime they said men do this, right? There was checking of myself, right? Going down the list of things that I am and I can do and going, that doesn't fit and that doesn't fit and that doesn't fit. But I also recognize those are just roles and responsibilities and they're generally culturally driven.
Very,
Um,
I feel like it's very culturally driven. Yeah.
and and we see and there are studies out there showing that the more that men spend more time being close, intimate with their kids, that the children respond in the same way that they do mom. Their bodies actually start creating oxytocin for snuggling and hugging and not just for play, which is a general thing that will happen. Play with your kid as a man for 15 minutes. They get the same level of oxytocin as if they're hanging out with their mom for 15 minutes on the couch snuggling. But if that a consistent, constant thing that you're doing, their body just reacts to it and says, this is a safe place, regardless of if you're play or snuggling. So for me, it was really just this constant, that doesn't fit, that doesn't fit. But it never, like I said, I didn't come out till I was 38. So I just thought I was a weird person, weird guy. I said I was queer for a really long time, but no one really understood what that meant either. And so I was never really treated any way that made me feel safe and understood. So when I first came out as non binary, that gave me the permission to call myself trans, right? And then that's what a lot of people in the trans community call breaking the egg, where we're all in this egg and then our egg breaks and we start becoming the people we were always meant to be because there's nothing actually keeping us into what we were before. And so in that, I've actually began to identify as a trans woman more than as a non-binary person. I do think that I chose non-binary to be a little bit more safe while at the same time being a little bit more confrontational, right? Forcing people to use they, them, put them in a position where they go, I actually have to think about who this person is. Right? I can't just make the assumption and move on because anytime that used to happen, it never landed with who I actually am. But as I come out as a trans woman and I enter spaces, people start actually treating me by default in the way that I was hoping to be treated before.
And so, like that point, I think about being treated the way I would like to be treated. Um, I guess I don't understand it that much because I guess I am treated the way I would like people to treat me, and I guess if that wasn't the case, then I'd be feeling differently. So, how do you, going back to that experience of yours? It seems like after many years, you had this question of, "Am I? There's something different. There's something that is not normal here." Did that
Mhm.
start? Was that triggered by a thing that happened, or was that just a gradual thing that happened all those years until you were 38?
It was really a constant thing. When I say it's a constant, I mean that it just showed up all of the time. I went and I joined this group. It was called Impact Training, and it was this long form training, group training, where or group therapy, whatever you want to call it. I called it a cult once, but uh, but in that you go through the breaking yourself down and really starting to understand yourself. And the final capstone, after spending like $7,000 with this group and all the training and like 14 days with them, you get this thing of go and do the thing that you're so scared to do. And my brain immediately went, I'm scared of heights. So let's go jump off a bungee cord. But then as I'm getting there, none of my body is going, yeah, that makes sense. This is the thing that we're going to overcome today.
Mm.
And so I went home to get ready and literally found myself cutting up a long pillowcase with a neck hole and armholes so I could go in a dress.
Okay.
Right.
And that
I
was the
was,
first time? You
I was 19.
okay, 19.
I'm not going to say that's the first time I was in a dress because my parents put me in a dress. All of the boys in my family in a dress. The other ones are trans, right? You can't put your kids in a dress and make them trans.
Mm.
There's studies for that. You can't do it. It wasn't the first time I'd been in a dress, but it was the first time I chose to be in a dress.
And how
It
did
was
that
the
make you
first.
feel?
It was really magic in that I felt me as I did that, right? As I was going around being that. But I didn't give myself permission to take that from that moment into the rest of my life. So there was that experience. There were a couple of times during at work as a software engineer where I would show up to work in a dress. And sometimes I would just go and sit and make sure no one saw me.
So
And
so
then
so wearing the dress, did that kind of give you that feeling of feeling, like, whole? Feeling whole or safe, or what was the feeling that you
oh God,
came to?
that is such a great question because the answer is yes and no. Like I finally had this full connection from the outside world into this thing inside of me that I had never acknowledged, not really. Despite, well, I'll talk about another constant, but so yes, absolutely, it finally felt whole, right? Where my body and my spirit were finally getting connected. And I didn't think of it that way at that time because it was also terrifying. It was really the first time that I'd let light shine into and on that person inside of me, right? And
You
so
you were being vulnerable.
I was actually being fully vulnerable,
Mm.
being someone that masked from my trauma, what I thought was just my trauma. And I realize now is my trauma and my identity.
So things were happening and you were just rolling with it, trying to understand what was going on, and learning in that process. So it kind of made you
That,
feel more of you, but obviously it was something different in a world that, is have different opinions on it. And so it's obviously being vulnerable in a way that might not be accepted by many.
and I think there's also an underlying thing that I haven't really mentioned there was that this is something I went and did with this group that has torn down my self worth and then built it back up to get again, which is why I call it a cult. It's not really a great way to do therapy,
Mm.
but I hid the dress when I left because I knew if my parents saw it, it would be a different experience. And so when I went home, that was an okay place. And they were actually safe people to be vulnerable with. And so it was still scary, but I felt safe. But I knew I couldn't carry that home. I could bring
Yeah.
that with me. So I had to pack it all back up, close up that little hole and go home and move
So you had that kind of separation of you,
constant.
essentially. Do you still have that separation now, or is that now unified?
No, I feel absolutely that's unified. I get dysphoria, which is interesting
Or what is
because
this for you?
yeah. So dysphoria, as opposed to, it's the opposite of euphoria, right? So we understand what euphoria is. We all love it. Dysphoria is the opposite, right? Where your body is just feels disconnected, feels bad. And I didn't used to get that because I didn't try and actually experience euphoria. So that's maybe instead of saying I didn't get that, it was more that I had it all the time and was just constantly dealing.
Mm. So
So
is this for you different to depression?
yes. So dysphoria is a specific experience that happens, or a specific feeling that happens, usually from an experience, and that experience can be expressions of the body, being out in places where all of a sudden you feel disconnected from the actual person you are. For example, a really good place of dysphoria. That's not the right word, but I'm gonna use it. But a really good place of dysphoria is actually the face for trans women because as much as I shave as often as I want to shave, as tight as I want to shave,
Mm.
you'll always get a little bit of 5 o'clock shadow or wherever, right? This is where a whole lot of trans women spend their time because you glance in the mirror and you see it and you go, oh, that's not a woman and that's not me. Not necessarily just that's not a woman, but that's literally just not me. Ugh, I don't feel like me again. And that's been the really cool part is this has been the first time I've been able to 39, 40 was when the first time that I was able to actually look at myself in the mirror and see something positive,
Mm.
see something that I liked looking at, see something that I didn't feel like I needed to put a beard on to hide it because I had a beard I had facial hair since I was 16. I had a goatee for a really long time and
And
then
sorry,
found
what,
out.
what changed that? What kind of made you feel like have that positive point?
Um, really, it was that practice of becoming of expressing myself as I am as a woman allowed me to start feeling the euphoria. I started recognizing those times when I felt good, like I felt connected to my heart, my soul, and my spirit, things that I'd never really felt before. And so that's really when dysphoria started showing up, was recognizing when that went away. When I looked in the mirror and I felt like I used to, where I felt like this isn't me necessarily.
Mm. So when we think about like women and men, it's when you take out the kind of just the roles and responsibilities that are associated with that. I feel a lot of a lot of those responsibilities and expectations is what really defines those things a lot of the times. And when you remove them, it's very hard to define what they are. So when you speak
Right.
about women, it made me feel more
Mhm.
of a woman. Are you talking about the roles and responsibilities? Are you talking about a feeling? What are you talking about here?
I love this question. Absolutely a feeling, right? Because I think as a cis man, you wake up and you go, yeah, I feel like a man today, right?
Well,
Like,
it's
or you don't,
I don't think about it. That's the thing.
right?
Like maybe because, and that's why I'm asking the question because it's very hard to relate to it because sometimes it comes to me where I'm asking, what would, as a man, what should I be doing here?
Mhm,
But it's not a thing that I think about a lot. It's only in certain situations. Like, what are my
mhm.
roles and responsibilities here as a man, especially
As a
as a
parent as
father,
well,
as
yeah,
a parent. But
right,
but yeah, I don't think about like on a daily basis.
right. So that's why I feel like I do say it is a feeling, but it is also why I spoke about the boxes at the beginning, because ultimately I feel good fitting inside this box. So as I shift into, I'm like, no, this actually makes me feel better fitting inside this box. Now, I
Mm.
also recognize that there's a lot of broken things about that box, right? That box needs some heavy repairs and reparation.
When you think
Even if
about
we,
when you think about, that box, 'cause it's really interesting that you said that it helped me kind of be in a box. I've never heard it in that way. So when you are because a box is something that is defined, right? And I guess when you have a lot of these things going around and it's not defined, it can be very confusing, and defining it has limitations, obviously, because you're putting yourself in a box, but at least it's something you understand now that you can
right,
work with. And so does that bring a certainty and a place of a safety with it?
a place of belonging, because
Belonging.
I get to not just like fit in the box, I get to change the box as part of the people in the box too, right? So I also get that opportunity to shape the box with the rest of the women that are currently trying to shape the box for themselves.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. And so to you, what you're saying is it is a feeling. Obviously, there are certain roles and responsibilities maybe that you connect with more. Um, and when you think about kind of gender identity, what's the difference between kind of like gender identity, gender expression, uh, sexual orientation, which I understand is kind of what you're attracted to?
Yes, I mean they're it's ultimately levels of complexity for a person, right? Um, let's take a butch lesbian, right? Butch lesbian, very much, or a masked butch lesbian. They're out there presenting as masked as masculine as they possibly can. So when I say mask in that context, as masculine as they possibly can, but they don't feel like they're a man. They very much feel like and identify as a woman, but they enjoy the gender expression of masculinity. So they enjoy that expression of masculinity. Um, just like you can have very effeminate gay men or even very effeminate straight men who very much identify as men, but like this expression. It feels better for them. So they're still tied, right? in that you can't really understand because gender expression is still culturally driven, right? How we understand what a gender expression is all culture. The expression is something that shifts and moves with the culture, where I feel like the identity may not. I say may not because I haven't experienced anything besides this culture and this world. If there's some magical world where this didn't exist, maybe we don't look at gender that way, but maybe we do. But it
Mm,
would probably be expressed different, right? I don't think that we would, if we took away patriarchy, I don't think that we would look at women as a weaker sex simply because the differences among the actual sexes is greater than the differences between the sexes. And I think the most obvious is I've been flooded with testosterone my whole life. But as I was at a farmer's market yesterday, this woman was walking by who had a football jersey on. And I thought she was actually wearing football pads underneath her football jersey. But she wasn't. She was just giant. She
that's
just
helpful.
had huge shoulders and huge arms and then like thinned down and then just had, so it was just this that shape. And, you look at that person, you go, really, would you have chosen me 5 years ago who looked very much like this versus that person on your football team? Because if you chose
Mm,
me, I'd call you an idiot because that person is going to knock me out.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so I get it now. So basically, gender identity is kind of like more about what you feel on the inside, connected to those things. But gender expression is how you want to express it. So you can feel female, but you want to express a bit of maleness. And
Mhm.
I, I guess what confuses me, I guess, is the
Yeah.
when I say express maleness, like what is actually that? What does that mean? Express male. What is maleness? Or feeling female or expressing female? What does that mean? Expressing female.
Ultimately, I do believe that means an expression of the cultural expectation because we can't escape, right? We can't not be part of the world and all of the millions of inputs that we get from TV to the way we walk around to what we eat and the advertising we see. Everything is driven to right now in this society specifically separate and create expectations and norms around the different sexes. So an expression is just understanding those norms and doing them, right?
So you do
Um,
feel like when people talk about, you know, I feel more female. Obviously, maybe there's a I guess there is a feeling to it, but you're saying also a strong factor of that is the cultural norm associated with what that means to that person.
if they want to express that, I may feel female, but then only want to express male masculinity. So, yes, in that you understand, you have generally a greater understanding of gender, of those expressions, of those rules. So you know how to play with them.
Mm.
Ultimately. So you
So,
know
so,
how to express the way you want to.
so is to so for you is gender kind of is part of the identity aspect?
Gender is definitely part of is an identity aspect. Gender is the identity aspect.
And so, I guess to me, when I think about identity, yeah, my identity, I guess, changes with experience. Things happen that change my identity. Um, it, do you feel then in that situation, it's experiences and kind of culture and kind of the environment that's changing people's identity when it comes to kind of female, male, things in between?
This is, I feel like you're ultimately asking like the nature nurture question, right? Is this something as we continue to experience the
Okay.
cultural expectations, does that then shape our identity? And I don't think the answer is simple because I don't think it's just cultural in that it is learned and then can just be thrown away because we understand a whole lot more about our bodies now and how they react to trauma, how they react to inputs. And so even if my answer is really maybe. I believe it more happens very early on as part of our body's natural process of finding community because we have a biological drive to find community. That's why I say both in that we have this biological drive to find community. We see the cultural expectations of male and female. And so we latch onto those and we begin gender expression, right? Would that happen without these cultural expectations? That's where it's hard to know. We don't know because we're just seeped in it. But we do know that there are biological components. We do know there are biological times when, again, we are flooded with specific amounts of hormones as our brain is forming identity, as it forms the areas of our brain that understands me and you. We're also changing inside of our body. It doesn't all happen right when we're born. It's constant change, or especially not right when we're conceived. There's a lot of change that happens within the body based off of what's happening to mom or what's happening to the person carrying you, I should say, because they may not be mom. They may not want to be called mom. They may be a surrogate.
Right.
So, whatever's happening there changes a lot of that. So there is a biological component, but we can't separate that necessarily from the cultural expectations that we then latch onto and identify with, and how those then actually shape our brain.
Yeah.
Then goes,
So,
I get this enough that I'm going to create shortcuts that then just become part of you and not things you think about.
yeah. So I get how, you know, the hormones can impact your identity as your brain's developing. We all have different ratios of hormones that impacts how your brain gets developed, and during those younger years, that can form part of your identity. But you mentioned there's something about wanting also community. Can you just explain that a bit more?
Um, so there's a lot of how we're built, how our brains are built that drive how we act, right? It's not that we go, this is a community and I like community, so we're going to be a part of it. We are social creatures. If you put someone, let's look at all of the times that we have forced humans to live together in awful situations, right? And what's happened. In fact, one of my favorite books I just read was George Takei's memoir of him being put in the American concentration camps for Japanese people, one of them being in my state. He didn't go to the one in my state. He went to two, and one of them because his parents refused to say that they were no-nos. And so no-nos were sent to a high security place. And in these places, they continued to experience dehumanizing experiences. But what's cool is they formed community. Those people formed more humanity. They formed great relationships that they ultimately mourned when these places closed. They also mourned the safety of knowing that the anti-Asian sentiment that runs rampant in the streets that would turn violent, they were safe from that ultimately, but they form community. So when you put people, even in really terrible places, they form community and they form heart and soul and love. But you isolate a person and they will go crazy.
Mm,
We cannot stand to be alone. And that's not just because we don't like it. That's because our body literally needs community because we recognize it is necessary for human survival. Humans have never survived on their own. We have
yeah,
always survived as a community. And
100%.
so that's what I mean is we're built to build community. We need it. And so as we come into community, we learn if this community isn't actually welcoming for me, I need to mask. I need to put on a mask. I need to be something else. Because if not, I will go crazy, literally.
So
And so we
so
have
are
to
are you saying that some people might put a mask to belong in this community?
mask to belong in the general community. So I put on a mask to belong
Oh,
in my
you before. Okay.
in terms of, are you saying, do some maybe trans people put on a mask in order to belong in the LGBTQ community? I would say some, yeah, especially if you are surrounded by what are called TERFs or trans exclusionary radical feminists, or what I like to just call conservative women that don't like trans people. In that space, yeah, you may put on a mask. You may pretend you were never trans in the first place, right? Which ultimately still steals your identity from you because they treat you like you've had a similar experience than they have and you haven't.
Mm.
And so they never actually get to know you. You never actually get to form full community, but you're not alone anytime.
That's really interesting. And the biggest thing I see when I talk to people about this, especially people who are not connected to the LGBTQ plus community, is they what they fear, it seems the most, is teaching those things to their children.
Mhm. Mhm.
I
Mhm.
think that is the stickiest point I've seen. They could
100%.
be fine with the community, happy and embracing the community, but then to them, they feel children are malleable, children believe many different things, depends on how they feel.
Mhm.
That could influence them. What's your take on that?
Wow. I this is actually one of my very favorite conversations, so I'm really glad we ultimately got to it because we now know, in fact, the description of gender dysphoria came from a study that a now defrocked, that's not what you actually call them, but defrocked scientist published about a boy that, I don't know, accidentally or something received a sex change surgery. And so they tried to treat this boy who was born a boy, who felt like a boy as a woman by just putting dresses on, putting them in that box and doing all this stuff. He would rip his dresses off. This is the only thing he knew. He would rip his dresses off.
Do
He
you know
would
what
yell.
age
He
that
would
was?
go cut his hair. He started pushing back against it around 5, 6, 7, and continued into puberty and was super traumatized by the experience. And then, of course, the scientist writes about how then being trans is bad instead of don't force people to be trans. So we see very much that there is a biological component that is not culturally driven that will build our identity. So we know that exists. So I feel like the motivations of those parents are protection, 100% protection, right? Now, what they're protecting is really where we run into problems because in some senses, and what I think is usually the most attempt at being noble, they're trying to protect their kids from becoming bullied, right? They're trying to make sure that they don't have a hard life. If you're a new parent, it just, it's, it eats you all of the time. It becomes something that you think about all the time. How do I protect? How, not just from like walking down the stairs, because they're going to try and kill themselves all the time. From like 1 to 3, they are just chaos suicide machines.
Yeah.
Um, but also just the how do I make sure that they know how to interact in a social situation so they don't get picked on, right? How do we know that they know how to stand up for themselves? How do we teach them how to stand up for other people and the joy that brings for them? All of those things. So I think that's where a lot of people, I think that's where most parents sit, is that fear. The problem with that is that you become your kid's first bully because you create the box and you force them into that box and you punish them when they're not fitting into that box so that they don't get punished by kids later. So in those cases, really the best thing to do to protect your kid is create the most safe space you can for them to be while they're at home. So they know they have at least one place where they get to fully be themselves. And you can talk about needing to mask because you live in deep rural Tennessee, but at home, you're safe. And you can have that level of depth of conversation with your kids all the way as early as 4. My kid is 5. My youngest is 5. He understands the way he feels. He understands the way I feel. He doesn't necessarily express it a whole lot because he's way more interested in natural disasters and Roblox. But I can say, hey, call me she. Absolutely. Right. And she just, and then started calling me mom. It was just fine. And I've been trans almost the whole time that I've had this child. I think for a lot of parents, this big pushback against DEI or this whole ridiculous about CRT here in the United States being pushed on kids, which is
What's
never.
CRT?
CRT was critical race theory, which is actually a lens that is applied at the academic level, understand social impacts from decisions being made and just to understand those decisions through a racial lens. We were never teaching our kids what were we teaching. In fact, I went to what we were teaching our local kids. They were teaching them how to be giraffes, how to be the ones that stick their neck up and look around for people that need help, and how to be the ones that say, I see something that is wrong. I see someone that is not being treated the way they wanted to be treated. That Ultimately, here's how we stand up for each other. The problem with that for a lot of parents is that when those kids brought those lessons home, they conflicted with the teachings and beliefs of their parents. Hey, we want to make sure, I learned about gay people in class today, right? And we want to make sure that they can get married because we look out for people. We want people to be joyful. We want people and we see how it's benefited society. Ultimately, married gay men pay lots more taxes than depressed homeless men that have felt like they can't be themselves. And so they can't actually find their own place. When we're happy, we do better for everybody. But then the parents have to then confront their own biases, their own prejudices. And they're being asked to confront those things by their children, which in a lot of culture around, especially the States, especially in conservative cultures, the idea is that you own your children. Your children are yours. This is the whole parents' rights. I have rights over my children. I own my children. And the thing that I'm owning is telling me that I'm doing something wrong is a direct example of the same thing that happens when communities, poor people push back against rich people. It's just, you're supposed to be treating me as an authority and you're not.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think it's difficult for
Mhm.
parents, I guess, because on one side you want your child to obviously have a breadth of experience and kind of be who they are, because who you are makes you, when you're connected to that, obviously you're happier, you're more focused. At the same time, you have these views of what will hurt someone, which is your views, which might be different to what another person has. What might hurt someone might help them based on your understanding of the world. And you're trying to, it's so hard to like not enforce the right amount that also allows them to experience the world. It's very difficult to find that balance.
I love that you said that because as a parent that is trying to make sure that my kids don't feel like the right way to be is trans, right? The right way to be is gay. Um, we think about this all the time. How do I talk to you about the way I want to be, like my understanding of the world? How do I help you understand what's out there without saying, and this is the way you're supposed to be, right? So we leave that to simply, actually, it's where my tattoo comes from, which is do go out into the world and make people feel better and happier and more whole. And that will be basically the judge of you. So by their fruits, you will know them. So if you go out and you create spaces where people feel safe and they feel happy, right? And they're not hurting themselves because science shows they're not hurt. But you go out and you really just try and create that respect for those people and then understand someone may be in a different place where I may say they're not hurting themselves. I know that my brother, my oldest brother, would say, oh, they absolutely are. Because in his religion, there is a one way to not just be a person, but to be a family. And if you're not doing that, you're ultimately you're going to have eternal pain. You're going to have to work harder in the afterlife to recover from these decisions here. So yes, in his view, he's not seeing someone's doing something different from me. He's absolutely seeing this person's hurting themselves in a spiritual, and that's so scary, right? But ultimately, I think most of us would rather our kids and our siblings and our parents be alive.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
that's
100%.
really most of the time the choice you make. We're at 50% of trans people have suicide ideation. A ton attempt suicide. It's especially bad in super conservative states like mine, especially now, when kids can't go and identify to the doctor how they feel. They can't tell their parents how they feel. So they commit suicide because they can't be themselves. They actually can't form community. But then that suicide just looks like a cis suicide. And so it doesn't get counted.
Mm. Yeah.
And so that's what we're seeing a lot right now, especially in the most recent report from the UK.
What do you say to the argument that if you do feel like a female or a male, why do you need to play with your hormones? From
Hmm.
add things to the hormones or things like that.
I'm gonna answer that in two ways. One, you don't. There are tons of trans people. I'm not taking HRT currently. I've been talking with my partner on what that might look like. And we're probably going to explore it when I'm in a safe country from which I can explore that, because it is not currently safe in my state with the way they're currently tracking it. But lots of people just choose not to. They don't care to necessarily go through the hormone therapy, or I'm not planning on getting a sex change cert. I have no interest in. Um, but on the other hand, I imagine if something happened to you where all of a sudden your body just went boom, estrogen, a ton, and you woke up with full on mammary glands and big boobs, that you'd go, I probably want to fix this.
Hmm. Yeah.
If you woke up and all of a sudden you had some nice D's and they weren't like man boobs, they were obviously boobs,
That'd
you'd
be a
go, shit. You'd
yeah.
call the doctor and you'd be like, I don't know what just happened, but I have boobs and I don't want boobs.
Mm.
And you would go and get gender affirming surgery. And in fact, most gender affirming surgery and gender affirming treatment is on cis people who have had expressions in their bodies that are sometimes ambiguous or sometimes completely different than what they want. And so they get gender affirming surgery, they get gender affirming care. We see it all the time. In fact, 11, my understanding, 11% of people are born intersex. So intersex is when your body, your sex, the actual sex expression of your body is ambiguous enough to require intervention to fit inside the box
I'm not
of
sure I understand
cis.
that. What do you mean?
So some people are born with because well, let's actually have a small biology
Let
lesson
us.
here.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's
the
never too
penis
late.
and testicles and testes
Yeah.
are transformations of the well, their growth from a switch from the same material and information as the vulva and vagina and
Yeah. So,
clitoris.
so it can try. Yeah.
And so, as we know, this isn't someone God turning on a light and there is light or there is dark, right? There's times when hormones are being flooded into the body that craft the body. If those hormones are more equal, if those hormones are non-existent, your genitals may not form in the way that you expect them to. And this comes like, I don't, I don't know if you know this. So one of the coolest things I found is there are XY women walking around right now, their whole lives being women, having no clue they have a Y chromosome until they try and have a baby and they can't. There are
XY women.
XX men. Yes. So XX men who have no Y chromosome, but had enough testosterone pushed onto them through gestation as well as wherever
So when
that
you
they
say
go
men, do you
through
mean like biologically men?
everything about them looks like man. And that's why when someone says, what is a biological woman? XX and XY don't make any sense. They can't. And it's even more evident by the fact that the Y chromosome is probably going to be gone in the next 200 years. Yeah. So they actually have these chromosomes that by simple definition would mean that they are a man, but their whole life they have been a woman and there hasn't actually been any intervention to make that happen. That's just something the body can do as part of the complex process of creating the body, right? It's not a simple thing, right? It's not here's plan A
Yeah.
and here's plan B. So, so that's one example of being intersex. Now, a lot of those people don't actually know, and so they don't identify as intersex. But some people have both genitals. They have both a vaginal canal and a penis, right? Or they may have something that It just doesn't look like either, which we see in literally every other part of our body all of the time. Sometimes our ears come out weird. Sometimes our nose comes out weird. The idea that sometimes our genitals come out weird and sometimes the way we feel about ourselves comes out weird should just be a natural next understanding.
I want to go back. I think it always, when I speak to people, always goes back to the children thing.
Yes.
And so when you spoke about kind of hormone changes, it's the same thing with parents being scared, actually also being scared from their children now, with them bringing this up and going through that process. Um, so I guess it's a difficult question to answer, but what age is where, there should be a line in terms of actually maybe the kid is too small for them to go, especially through that hormone kind of process, because things might change, right?
Mhm.
As we kind of mentioned before, a big part of this is identity. And, our identity kind of changes, and we kind of explore that and we understand better as time goes by, as we experience and play out these things in the environment,
Mhm.
and see the feedback. So what age should be kind of where we say that's too young?
Well, that's a hard question because I just said that there
It
are
is,
times
yeah.
when we do gender affirming care on infants because they don't fit inside a box. So when
Yeah.
we say this isn't just do we use hormones on kids that feel away, because we already are accepting the idea of using hormones against their consent to put them into a box. So we already do this. So we want to talk about when is too early. We have to acknowledge that we're only talking about when is too early to listen to your kid. When is it too early to believe your child? And I don't think that's ever. I don't think it's ever too early to listen to your child. Now, nearly, not all, but nearly all interventions are completely reversible. Um, and so thus most trans children do not get the irreversible care. They just don't. Unless the doctor determines that is literally the only way they're going to live. And that's where the line should be drawn on experts in the field who spend their time, because it's friggin' required, to understand gender, to understand its impact on children, right? There are people that know more about this than our politicians. And our politicians will never know enough to create the right line. So the right line is let the doctors who understand the actual science, the complex science of gender identity, be in charge of that. Let the family rely on their community, themselves, their doctor, their religious representation to make those decisions on when and where and how. It's never going to make sense. And we are only going to create harm if we create a legal framework around when and where, because you will lose children. There are some children who feel that so deep in them that when they view their genitals, it is like being stabbed in the heart and twisted over and over again. And then to not be heard, or to be heard and told they still have to not do something. They just have to suffer. And that's where I want to really, where I believe we really fail children, is the idea that their changes in who they are and how they identify is any different than ours. If I were to tell you right now that when you're 70, you're going to look at your kids in a completely different way. And so I'm not going to give you childcare because you're going to be different in 40 years. That would be the stupidest thing for me to say. But we say it about kids all the time. Kids don't feel their feelings smaller than ours because they have smaller bodies. They don't experience and hold trauma at less levels than we do because they're smaller in their bodies. And in fact, they hold them stronger in their bodies. We should be listening to our kids the most because they're the ones that are exploring and understanding the world without those expectations. But to directly answer your question, I think the best framework you can say is recognizing that hormone replacement therapy, puberty blockers is going to be your best bet. We've been using puberty blockers for over 100 years. for tons and tons of different things. So using them for trans kids and saying that we don't really know what the outcomes are is simply false. It's not true. We've been doing this for a long time outside of trans issues. So if you can tell your kid, I hear you and I listen to you. And so I'm going to create a framework where we're going to put off puberty. And so that we can have a longer conversation around, are we doing this for any other reason besides finding our true self? Cool. That is a framework that could work. I don't think it's necessary to create that limit still, because I do think that there are way better systems for determining the right time to do these things. But I feel like the current way that it is approached by Western medicine before politics got involved was the way to do it, which was generally hormone blockers, then upgrade to the other hormone, right? Estrogen or testosterone. And then finally, in really, really dire situations, you would actually have surgery.
Why do you think politics are so involved in this now?
Oh, this is a long question. And the answer is ultimately not going to be one that is not political. The answer is simply that conservative policies around finance, around health, around retirement, around community are unpopular. They're just unpopular. Um, and so, for example, in the States, they were constantly losing based off of those policies. This was the Republicans at the time. They didn't have the social conservative understanding at all. It didn't exist in 40s. I don't remember. What happened was, as Nixon started recognizing this loss, they created the Southern strategy. The Republicans got together and started using racism, racist dog whistles, and other things in order to create fear and hate towards Black people and align that fear and hate with a specific political party. Where before, both parties were pretty terrible when we thought about it. It wasn't Democrats or Republicans that put Japanese people in concentration camps in the US. It was both parties. It was split pretty evenly across both, and it was only focused on policy. But by focusing on social issues and racism, you created people that started voting for that experience. And then because we love data and we will use data to do whatever we can, and it's just the best justification, we found how valuable that was. So the abortion debate in the US was crafted. Both parties did not care. Evangelicals did not care until someone said, we can use this as a political football, and crafted it as a political football, all on Wikipedia.
So you feel it's to kind of differentiate and have that kind of separation for people to choose from?
It is to allow people, and I'm going to say this in the not nicest way I will today,
Yeah.
allow people to rely on their bigotry, to rely on their implicit and explicit biases in order to choose a person and feel good about that without having any understanding of the actual consequences that happen from that choice, the policy consequences that happen from that choice. It allows people to identify those things that they're scared of. It really is creating fear and allowing people to vote for that fear.
Mm.
This is Fox News to a T. You do not go on Fox News to feel centered, to feel connected to your community. You don't go on Fox News to learn about what other people experience in this world and how that's different than you and how that's joyful. You go on Fox News to hate, to get angry at people that are doing things the way you don't want them to be done. Like drinking a milkshake from a straw was one of the things that they said Biden was bad because he used a straw once.
Yeah.
Right, the fact that Trump used a straw just like 6 before. But the goal isn't understanding, it's hate. And so the reason why is because gay people and lesbian people, lesbian cis people and gay cis people aren't bodies of hate anymore. They've become absorbed, just like Irish people did into whiteness, and Italian people did into whiteness, and Jewish people did into whiteness. Gay people got accepted into ultimately straightness. They're not straight. But if you present straight in your gay relationship, you have kids, it's just the two of you have a nice house, you have 2 jobs, cool. If you're polyamorous, not okay. And so it's really, they needed a new body of hate, and trans people are it.
Interesting angle.
Now,
I've never kind of heard that angle,
I
to be
want to
honest.
I want to be clear. This is at the political decision making level. I 100% believe that every single one of those people that hears those things and feels that fear have reasonable are reasonable reactions to the life experiences they've had. The North has not been good to the Deep South for a long time. When we talk about the labor movement, what we're ultimately talking about is the money that came from the North to come and mine in the South. And we did terrible things. The North did terrible things to those people. They build a mining town, mine would run dry, and then they destroy the road. If they were
Mm,
lucky, sometimes they just send some people in a truck and some guns, and the town would disappear all of a sudden. Because then at that time, the corporations actually owned those towns. They were their towns, they were their building. And if those people lived there and they didn't take care of them, they may report back and people get mad. So, but if they disappeared,
mm. Yeah,
and
that's
so
sad.
the labor movement wasn't, we don't want to work overtime. The labor movement was, we don't think the corporation should be able to murder us.
Yeah,
So these
which is a
people,
reasonable thing to ask for.
and and so then they see elites, they have this cultural generational trauma of people saying, we're here to do good for you, then turning around and being absolutely terrible. And they're still struggling with the lack of generational wealth being generated that should have been generated from a better labor um, stance by the government. They're still super, super poor. And it's ridiculous given how nice so many other things we have are. Uh, so latching on to hate, finding someone to hate,
To blame, yeah.
makes sense. It is literally a reasonable reaction. This
Mm.
is
And,
not
and I guess there's a lot of things you can blame, from immigrants to this to that. There's a whole list you can choose from. So D, I could speak with you about this for a couple more hours, but just to close this, what kind of support systems or resources have been most helpful for you and your family in navigating kind of the challenges that you've experienced?
um, this is a really long answer. This is a good question. I love this question. For me, in the state that I'm in, specifically, if I go and I use the wrong bathroom, I can be fined $5,000 and get sent to jail for 6 months. Um, and in a public bathroom. So if I need to go to the court for some reason, right? Those bathrooms are dangerous for me. And dangerous because if I go into the bathroom that fits for me, that I feel comfortable in, that's
Out of
also
curiosity, what bathroom is that?
the women's bathroom. So if I go into the women's bathroom, I can go to jail, right? But it's also the place where I feel the safest. And especially as I express myself like this. So you go, okay, well, just go in the men's bathroom. No big deal. Guess who's in the men's bathroom? Men. Who are the most dangerous people for trans women? Men. And if they're also told that this kind of a person is not allowed, they don't know who I am. They don't know if this little midnight shadow thing that I'm doing is makeup to make me look more masculine, right? They just don't know. And in that case, they're not going to call someone. I'm going to find myself at the business end of a fist, right? It's a dangerous experience for me to go to the bathroom in state-run facilities of my own state.
Yeah, just on that point, and I keep on going back to the same thing, which because this is what I also hear a lot of times. It's the children, right?
Mhm.
So like for someone who has a male or female going to the bathroom, a lot of people might use this to enter into those places. That's kind of a lot of what I hear.
Oh,
What's your kind of take on that?
I'm going to tell you, if men were actually punished for the amount of assaults that happen on women, this would make sense. Men don't need a reason to go into a women's bathroom and assault someone.
Mm.
Well, there's no bouncer there, right? And you go in. If a man enters a bathroom and there's two women in there, there's not one woman protecting the other woman. There's two women in danger.
I guess, yeah. From a kind of male female perspective, I get that point, but from a children kind of perspective,
So therein lies then the next thing, right? Because yeah, when you're talking like, hey, could someone use this? The other thing is like with kids, again, we don't see it. We never, we have one person that I think we've seen do this, say that they've done this. And this is after 10 years of people saying this is the reason why we need bathroom bills.
done what? Sorry, done what?
Went in pretending to be trans to try and do something. When most women's experiences, again, were men just following them into the bathroom anyway. But when you talk about the kids, this is actually one of my very favorite things because there are so many times where kids look at me and stare and they don't really understand. But guess what's really cool about kids? They don't understand a shitload of things. They are absorbing and understanding and crafting the world constantly. It doesn't scare them because everything is new all of the time. All of a sudden, someone's breaking the rules. They go, what's going on? Right. And so then it's not about me entering the room. It's about the parent creating the best learning opportunity for that person completely. And that is that person just looks a little different. And I've heard someone say that, right? Like, what's going on? That person just looks a little different. Okay.
Hmm.
That's it. Most
Yeah,
kids, you say, they just feel differently and they think about the world differently than we do. Okay.
yeah. I was coming at it from an angle of like danger of kind of men being in those places with children. But what you're saying is basically, it's not like you remove that and there's no danger.
No.
It still happens.
Yeah.
Um,
Boys,
but
boys and girls were being raped by their teachers in the bathrooms way before
yeah,
trans people existed. Because again, no one's going to stop that adult from going into that bathroom.
yeah.
Regardless.
But you just said something else that also rings a bell from what I hear, which is kind of the children like new and exciting. And what I hear a lot of parents say, they're worried that they might see this as new and exciting as children when they're kind of being educated about it, and they want to explore it, and that might lead to confusion because it's not something that they are or they feel connected with, but they might kind of keep on going on because it is in a way celebrated today in certain places. It's
Oh,
celebrated, but not
absolutely. No,
everywhere.
absolutely. No, I absolutely get it. And I'm going to tell you, they're not wrong. Being part of the LGBTQ community when you're in the community spaces, it's a very wonderful experience because here's a lot of people who have had a lot of trauma who are now trying to create safe spaces. Um, and that intention makes a difference. So I think I understand the fear, but I also want to point out that fear of it being exciting and new and going a specific direction is not any different than forcing them down another direction. One of the things, like, for example, my neighbor was like, first I was kind of worried that you're going to make your kids all queer. And I'm like, well, have you ever stopped and worried about your other neighbor making their kids all straight? We don't, but we recognize both of those are valid expectations and expression. So again, that both of those are valid expression, but we don't get upset if someone is straight and has straight kids. We get upset when someone is trans or gay and has gay kids. Why? Because we believe one of them is still more valuable than the other. And we look at other things that have happened from when we used to say, so some people will point at the statistics, right? We see this huge explosion of these expressions. We saw that same huge explosion of left-handed people when we stopped beating left-handed kids for wanting to write with their left hand. Once we
Mm.
stopped saying that was wrong and we started creating left-handed scissors and stuff like that, the number of left-handed kids skyrocketed. And you know what people said? They just want to use the other scissors. They want to be like their friend. It's not, you can't, something else that someone else said is like, If you believe that you can force your kids to be trans, you don't have kids. You can't force your kids to eat a cookie they don't like, even if it's a cookie. You put coconut on a cookie for me, I'm not going to like it. You can't force me to like it. Now, could I be socially pressured or can I find attraction with that community? Yes, 100%. But here's what's magic about that community, that once you go into that community and you start talking about, you don't really know how you feel necessarily. Guess what happens? They go, cool. Let us know how that changes, where that changes, and when that changes, so we can support you. You later come out and you're like, nope, super cis. Cool. One of the best examples. And um, you know what? I'm actually going to leave that community alone. If this ever gets anywhere, I don't want that community to be visited by people that are angry. But there are people that are kind of in that transitionary space of, I feel like something's different, but I don't know. And they're playing with their gender expression, that when someone goes, you know what, that's it, I'm actually trans. That community who believe they're cis, who identify as cis, they go, cool, have fun. That's very cool. You can continue to be here, but you're no longer the people that we are actually focusing on. So, enjoy yourself or whatever. But then if someone says, no, I am absolutely cis, I just love expressing myself as a girl. Cool. They love that too. And that's the thing about being attracted to something like this, is you're ultimately being attracted to freedom from those two boxes that you have to fit in. And once you get into that space and everyone's like queer and talking about the different things, and there's so many different ways of expressing that queerness, they may find some weird identity because there's tons of them. And great, they're welcome. But if they don't, they're still welcome, but they're not the focus.
Yeah,
So like,
makes sense. So,
oh
so, so
no.
yeah. So just to end this, for parents, for example,
Mhm.
is there a resource or support that you would recommend for them?
My first is just going to be a really good place to start is the Trevor Project. And now that's a US based. I don't know on the UK or Europe, but the Trevor Project itself started a long time ago and has been one of the best in just providing resources that help people understand. But I'm also going to say that your best resource is your kid. Ask, just like you would go and ask some expert. What does that mean? Ask your kid, right? Just like you would go and say, how do I treat my kid now that they did this? Ask your kid. They'll tell you. And if you start listening to your kid when they are not sure you are going to, you will create a relationship that you can plumb for joy and connectedness that will last until they're by your bedside as you pass on. It's not the kids that we ignore that feel loved and follow us around and love us and call us and talk to us about their days. It's the kids that feel heard. So go visit the Trevor Project. But if you're worried about, if you think, or if there's something they're already doing, talk to them. What does this mean to you? Start simply and only from curiosity. These other questions of like fear and all that, you will get to them. You will talk about them. You don't start there. Start with, how do I understand you? What does that mean to you? What about, cool, tell me more about that. How did you hear about it? Because then they may start telling you about these friends that are starting to make them feel whole. And then if those friends now have a safe place to go too, now your kid not only has the best parent that is creating the best environment for them, they have a community that they can bring along with them. They have community that they can connect with that they don't have to hide. I had to hide all my friends from my parents. I couldn't tell them how they made me feel. I couldn't tell them about the things that mattered to me because they weren't curious. They would just tell me what I was doing wrong. And again, my dad gave me the tools and skills to survive by just saying, you don't have to be like everyone. I don't think he knew that this is how far it would go. I think there's sometimes he was like, should I have done something different? But he did give me that idea that you can love yourself.
That's awesome. Dee, thank you so much for sharing what you shared with us, for being honest. Really appreciate your time, and hope to have you on again in the near
Love
future.
to. Would love to. We can dive into even more specifics or just spend a whole lot of time doing this some more. This has
Yeah,
been super amazing, Hadi. Thank you for your curiosity. And thank you for not letting me forget to answer the deeper question about kids. I'm glad that you brought us back around to that because I do know, like I said at the beginning, it is driven by the need to protect your kids. So, like, I get it. You're not a bad person for having the reactions you have about what's happening in the world, but get curious with your kids and you're going to find magic, like literal magic happen as they wrap their life with yours instead of against yours.
love it. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.